So today we're going to be talking about some of those pedals that just didn't quite make the cut. So as many of you will know, if you've seen our recent storytime video on the history of the company, Xander have been around since 2016 and, well, a couple of years before that really, unofficially. And obviously with that amount of time building and developing products, it kind of comes with the territory that some of them just aren't going to turn out the way that you wanted them. And that's exactly what we're going to look at today, some of those pedals that we've either discontinued or just never came to be because they just weren't what we expected. So first up we have the Warbler Dual Vintage Ferriaro. This one had a fairly short lifespan in two iterations. The first one you will have just seen, and then the second one that had a slightly nicer printed case. So this was based on a circuit that's similar to what's used in some magnetone amps. So it's a true pitch vibrato that's controlled by an LED and an LDR. So an LED and an LDR is basically like a poor man's optocoupler. It's how a lot of univibe type circuits work, how some optical phases work, optical tremolos, that kind of thing. So what we did was take two of those circuits and put them in one box. So one had a slower overall rate but more depth. The other one had less depth but a faster overall rate. It was kind of a trade-off on that circuit, because if you wanted the deeper vibrato effect you had to sacrifice some of that faster rate range. On the back of one you'll see there is an expression input, and then on the back of the second one you'll see there's two expression inputs. So yeah, you've got your in and out and then the two expression jacks, and what those were for were they allowed you to control the rate of each vibrato independently. It's a really cool circuit, it's a really unique sound. It's not the kind of Boss VB2 really kind of extreme vibrato, it's more of a throbby, phasey kind of sound where it's not like a perfect like sine wave up and down. It kind of comes in and comes out like more of a triangle kind of shape. And it sounds really good, but unfortunately there's not really much you can do with this circuit, and it didn't really sell well enough for us to warrant keeping it in the lineup. As is always the way, since we've discontinued it a couple of years ago, people have since messaged me about it, but unfortunately I don't think there's just enough demand to bring it back. And there are a couple of really good options out there for people that are kind of making a similar kind of circuit that I think you should check out. Namely the Bigfoot Effects Magnavibe, which I'll put a picture right there. Next up we have the Shake and Tremble Dual Speed Tremolo. So yes, if any of you are wondering, this is indeed named after the Django Django song Shake and Tremble, and I highly suggest that if you haven't already heard of Django Django you go and check them out immediately. So the idea behind the Shake and Tremble was to recreate the sound of an old cranked Fender amp with the tremolo on. The Shake and Tremble isn't just a tremolo effect, it actually has an active preamp control here, which can get pretty crunchy depending on what guitar you're using and how high up you set that level control. This is the second version, so similar to the Warbler, we had a nice kind of printed version done. So for the switches, you've got the engage or bypass switch on one side, and then on this side you've got a fast slow switch, which is effectively a double speed switch. It's a pretty standard take on a traditional transistor based sine wave tremolo, and as you'll see on the back here, more of those expression controls And for this circuit, you had one for the rate and one for the depth. It's a great sound, but it's somewhat limited in what you can do and how far you can take the circuit. So as much is the case with both the Shake and Tremble and the Warbler, at the time when these came out, the demand for tap tempo modulation was growing, and these didn't really fit into that landscape. It would have taken a hell of a lot of work to get these circuits up to that kind of level, so it was easier to ditch them. And that's kind of where the idea for what then eventually turned into the Junipero became, where we could kind of put all of these types of effects into one box, but then also include the tap and the MIDI and stereo and all that stuff. Next up, we have a pedal that never ever came to be, and that is the Photographer, Buffer and Compressor. So this was a pedal that we worked on a few years back. So I kind of approached this one from more of a utilitarian perspective, because I needed a buffer at the time, and the idea was, let's just develop something that can sit at the front of someone's signal chain, and it does all the nice kind of stuff that you would want it to do to a clean signal, but you can also switch it off so that it's not acting funny with like weird fuzzes and stuff like that. So that's where the idea of the switchable buffer came. And then the compressor is actually based on the Jangle Box circuit. So you've got a gain, an attack knob, and then like a three-way bright switch. And it does sound really good, but it has quite a high noise floor, and the one thing I've always tried to be keen to do is not release anything that is kind of already being covered by someone else. I mean, within reason. Obviously, we're still releasing fuzzes and stuff like that, but I mean quite specifically. And I'm really keen on not releasing anything that is also being done better by someone else. And I think at the time when we were developing this, obviously the things like the Cali 76 were coming out, and it was far better than what we were putting together, and it wouldn't really be fair of me to package something up in a nice boutique-y style box when it's not as good as it could be, and there's nothing really inside that's that special. I don't really use compression that much, and I think this was a lesson in me now going forward only developing things that I really care about, because I find that I can't really invest myself properly in developing a product if I wouldn't use it. So this was kind of a lesson in that sense, and since then we've only released stuff that we're really proud of and would use ourselves. These last three are ones that we've actually discontinued fairly recently, mostly because they don't really fit into the format that we're looking to move into over the next few months. And the first of those three is the Exosphere Atmospheric Reverberator. So rather annoyingly, I don't actually have one of the original Exospheres. I'm not sure whether it's been lost or I sold it or threw it away, but I can't seem to find it anywhere. But what I do have is this rather weird intermediary one that has this kind of cool spaceman on the front. We never actually sold any of these with this graphic, so this is entirely a one-off. So the Exosphere is a dual reverb pedal based on the Belton / Accutronics reverb brick. This reverb brick has been used in loads of boutique reverb pedals over the last 15-20 years, until things like the Spin FV1 came in and pretty much took its place. It's used in a lot of pedals that are said to emulate the classic Spring sound, although I'm not really convinced that it sounds much like a Spring. What the Exosphere has is a pre and post level control, so you can actually dial in kind of an overdrive with it, really, depending on what kind of guitar you're using. And also the reverb itself will distort before your clean signal does, because it runs at a lower voltage and has less headroom. There's a kill dry switch, there is a dark switch that works with the damp control. There's a switchable reverb control, so you can set one low and one high, so for like a low mixed one, and then for more of a cavernous kind of ambient sound. And again, we have expression jacks on the back. One controls the second reverb and then the other one controls the decay. Because one thing that's cool about the reverb brick is that once you start messing around with the resistance on the feedback, you can actually get it to self-oscillate like a delay would. The reason we discontinued this is because, well, there's a few reasons actually. So the reverb bricks themselves are quite expensive and they're quite bulky. If you're dealing with a smaller enclosure where you want to try and have loads of knobs, I mean the bricks are kind of like this kind of size. And they just take up a lot of physical space. The second reason is that no matter how much filtering and fiddling around with the circuit around the brick, the circuit still very much sounds the same. And I think once you kind of clock what that sound is, you can never really miss it again. So there are certainly a few boutique reverb pedals out there that have a very similar sound. And it kind of harks back to when I said when we were developing the Junipero, we weren't actually just developing the Junipero. What we were doing was developing a platform that could house many sets of digital effects. So obviously once that was ready, there was really kind of no need to have a standalone single reverb unit. What we can actually do is build something eventually that's similar to the Junipero but with reverb. But don't get me wrong, this sound is a very cool, interesting sound. It has a lot of kind of delay artifacts and echo artifacts in it. It's a really interesting sound. So I think if and when we develop a reverb pedal in that kind of larger format, I think we will take this as inspiration for one of the patches. Next up, we have the Tape Deck Lo-Fi Modulated Delay. So many of you will have seen this version of the Tape Deck, and that's probably what you know it for looking like. But there were actually two versions that existed for that one. One that looked like this, excuse how battered up this is, it's very old, that just has a kind of sticker on the front, similar to the first version of the Shake and Tremble and the Warbler. And then, again, a nice shiny version that's in a new, come on, focus, there we are. Right, yes, so one that sits in this slightly nicer box, same graphic but just in a printed box. And there's not a huge amount of difference between all of the different versions. The first version only has one expression jack on the back, and that is for controlling delay time, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a long time. And then the second version has two jacks on the back, so one for time and one for feedback. And then the final version is pretty much exactly the same, except you now have a tail switch for buffered bypass. So the Tape Deck is based around the PT2399 chip, which is pretty much, up until fairly recently, the only chip that was ever used in any boutique small company made delay pedal. It is a digital chip, but it is incredibly good at replicating analog tape style delays because it's fairly lo-fi, it's not rated for that long of a delay time. Adding in some basic filtering can change the sound quite dramatically. I think probably one of the most well-known delay circuits built off of this is the Mad Professor Deep Blue delay. I would imagine they've sold millions of those at this point in time, and I think that's probably the most well-known pedal that uses this chip. But there are literally hundreds of others. So what we did with the Tape Deck is you've got your standard time, feedback, mix controls. There's a tone control, so you can kind of darken or brighten the repeats, and that kind of affects how the feedback works as well, because when you start taking out all the low end and you're just filtering high end, it kind of feeds back faster. There's a modulation section, so you've got a rate, depth, and then like a shape control for a a smoother sine wave and then more of a kind of square triangle wave kind of thing. A more just choppy sound. The modulation is foot switchable, so you can have it on or off. There's also a trim pot on the inside, so you can have it that when you turn that mod switch on, it kind of kills the delay time, and you can use it as like a tape modulation flanger kind of sound, where you just kind of get that weird, crazy modulation. But the key thing that we changed on the Exosphere is that we took this chip that I think is rated for around 500 or 600 milliseconds, and we kind of broke it so that it goes up to nearly 3000. Granted, when you do get past kind of 1 second, it starts to really break down and gets quite noisy and disruptive, but I think that is what a lot of people loved about this pedal. Which may leave you thinking, why did we discontinue this if it was so popular? And I think what it really comes down to is the fact that we really wanted to develop a pedal that has tap tempo, and the PT2399 is notoriously difficult to work with when it comes to that. Chips aren't particularly consistent with their max delay time, meaning whatever system you develop to run the tap tempo, it has to be calibrated each time, or it could drift off if you get a bad batch of chips. It's also just a lot of work to get something working as a tap tempo pedal, especially with so many other great pedals that are already using this chip. What we wanted to do is create something that was a little bit more versatile. So again, similar to the Exosphere, I think as and when we ever develop a larger format pedal that's similar to the Junipero but for delay, we will probably replicate this sound in it, at least to some extent. And last, but certainly not least, we have the Avalanche harmonic clipping trifecta. So along with the Cyclone, the Avalanche was actually developed pretty much at the same time, in that it was one of our first pedals, and this is the first iteration of it. As you can see, it's rather dusty where it's been sat on the shelf for a good few years. The basic circuit is the same in both, so you've got kind of a light drive, medium gain drive, and then like a really aggressive over the top one knob fuzz. The main difference between the first and second versions is that we added in these three-way toggle switches on the second version. So for the first drive, for the light drive, you've got a bright switch and a three-way clipping mode switch. For the second drive, you've got another three-way clipping switch, and then for the fuzz, you've got a three-way kind of bass boost fat switch. The idea behind this pedal was developing an all-in-one dirt solution for those guys and girls that need a smaller, compact board. Maybe they're doing a lot of fly gigs, something like that, and you've just got here's your drive, here's your distortion, here's your fuzz, and it's all in one box, and all you need to do is adjust the level knob. And with these circuits, we kind of developed them specifically so that they work very well with your guitar's volume and tone control, so you can dial back to near enough clean, especially with the first two drive circuits. You can really dial back into like a lower gain fuzz when you pull back the volume with the fuzz. They're completely independent effects, so they can be used on their own, or you can stack them together. And yeah, this one actually also did pretty well for us as well. And while I'm talking about the Avalanche, that actually reminds me, so 2 seconds. Oh, excuse me, rather sweaty in here today. So what we actually did a few years ago was take the individual circuits from the Avalanche. You've got the crunch, the drive, and the fuzz, and we put them into their own little box. So you've got the C, the D, and the F. Right here. This is part of a series we were developing at the time called the Elements series, and what they were meant to be were kind of stripped back, like plain enclosure with a sticker on top. Very minimal graphics. We actually have a version of the Shake and Tremble and the Warbler in this, as well as the Cyclone, I believe. But it never really took off. People weren't really that interested. People were just buying the full version still, so we kind of quickly stopped making them. And the main reason for us really discontinuing this one is because it just doesn't work in the new smaller format that we're moving over to. So obviously the Avalanche has 3 switches. We're moving over to a vertical, smaller sized box, which you can only really accommodate 2. But who knows, maybe in the future we'll start mucking around with those circuits individually, maybe we'll build out upon them, and maybe we'll release 3 new pedals all based on the circuits that are in the Avalanche. Maybe. And that's it, up to date. I'm sure we'll be releasing another one of these in a few years' time when we have a load more products that have not worked. But I think this is part of a wider story that I'm trying to tell you guys about the kind of history of us and the stuff that we've released and stuff that hasn't worked. And I think that all helps bring context around why we make the products we do now and why we build things the way they're built now. But yes, thank you so much as always for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe if you wish. It's great to see the channel that has been growing over the last few months, and we're keen to kind of keep up that momentum. Let us know in the comments which of the products maybe you've owned some of them. Let's hear about it. And if you want any of them brought back, be vocal about it, because we're only going to bring stuff back if people want to buy it. Thank you again, and we will see you next time.